Hi, welcome to our virtual field trip to a wetland. We're going to be exploring the West Hylebos Wetlands today. This is a very nice wetland that's located in Federal Way, Washington. And so we'll start our walk and move into the wetland. Okay, so we're down at the boardwalk now, and we're starting to move into wetter areas, so we're starting to see some of the plants that are found in wetlands. Now, what makes up a wetland? There are three characteristics that we look for. One is the hydrology. You have to have the water in order to have a wetland. You need to have hydric soils. These are the soils that demonstrate the qualities that they achieve after being saturated. And then the third are the plants, and we're going to focus on the plants today. And there are two types of plants you'll find in a wetland: the obligate, which are the ones that have to have these saturated conditions, very wet conditions. You'll only find them in very wet areas. Or the facultative, and these are plants that can adapt to the wet conditions. And so right here we can look out and see that we have a lot of salmonberry, and we take a slightly closer look here, you can see that the salmonberry are fairly tall, about 6 feet tall. They've got the leaves. Let me come up here and you can see how they've got these leaflets, 5 leaflets coming off, and that's indicative of the salmonberry, and they've got some thorns on them as well. The leaves are have serrated edges. Now another plant, and we'll look over here, is the Indian plum. And so the Indian plum has these oval leaves, and they're alternate on the branches. This also can get very tall. Okay, so we'll continue down the boardwalk for a bit. So we've moved down the boardwalk a little ways, and we have some very nice salmonberry on either side of this boardwalk. But the other thing we have is this big leaf maple, several big leaf maples, very tall. You'll find these in moist areas, and you can see the classic maple leaf here. And then if we move over, here we've got another tree that you'll find frequently in wet areas, and this is an alder. Alder have oval leaves with serrated edges. The bark of the alder is grayish, frequently has a lot of moss and lichens on it. So these are two trees that you will find in wetland areas: big leaf maple and the alder. Okay, so we've moved down a little bit and we've come across some more plants that I'd like to show you. For a start, we'll look at this particular it's a fallen log actually, and all of these ferns are licorice ferns. And licorice ferns generally come up from a single rhizome, and they have pinnate leaflets on either side, so that means you just get one leaflet coming off on either side and they don't subdivide further. They tend to be a little bit ruffly, and they do come up singly as opposed to other types of ferns such as sword ferns that come up in clumps, and we'll see some sword ferns as we move further in. The other plant here that I wanted to show you is the Pacific red elderberry, and the elderberry has these. Now this right here, let me back out a little bit here so you can see. This is one leaf. Looks like 5, but those are leaflets that make up the total leaf. And so if you look at these are compound leaves. This is one leaf right along here, made up of 7 leaflets in this case. And so this is the Pacific red elderberry. It is deciduous. We're having a very warm October right now, and so a lot of the leaves haven't started turning yet, but this will turn and drop its leaves for the winter. And then another tree, and the other tree here is the western red cedar, Thuya plicata. It also can tolerate wet conditions, so you'll find it in and about wetlands. One tree that you won't see that's common in the Northwest is Douglas fir. Douglas fir don't like having wet feet, and so you won't find them located in wetlands. But you will see, as far as the evergreens go, you will see western red cedar and the western hemlock, Tsuga heterophila, and we'll see that in a minute. The other maple that you'll see is the vine maple. Now the big leaf maple has very large leaves, 5-lobed. Here's an example of vine maple leaves, and you can see they are 7 to 9 lobed, and they're much smaller. Give you a just look at the size of these. I'll hold my hand down here, and you can see, whereas with a big leaf maple, that leaf is much bigger than my hand. With the vine maple, the leaves are much smaller. The other thing we've got right in here is skunk cabbage. And so these large leaves here are skunk cabbage. The flowers are gone. They were out in the spring. But skunk cabbage are obligate. You'll only find them in very wet areas. And we see next to that, if I can get it into my viewfinder here, this fern here. This is a lady fern, and you can see it's got bipinnate because it comes out, and where each leaflet comes off, it further subdivides and then further divides, so it's actually tripinnate. And these come up from a central clump, multiple fronds, and can get as high as 6 feet. And they really like wet conditions, and in this particular wetland you'll find a lot of very, very, very tall lady ferns. So let's continue on down the boardwalk and see what other things we can find. Okay, well, here's our classic sword fern. Sword ferns like it shady and moist, and so we can see that we've got a lot of fronds coming up from a central base, and that each of these fronds has leaflets coming off on either side, and these are pointed leaflets. So you can see they have kind of a point to the tip, and if we get really close here, we can see that they've got serrations. They're serrated, and so that's one of the identifiers for a sword fern. Let me back out here a bit and see if we can look at some of the spores. So here you can see on the back of the frond, these are the sori that contain the spores, the reproductive spores for the sword fern. Now we have another tree right behind here. This is the western hemlock, Tsuga heterophila, and you can identify this a number of ways. If you look closely at the needles, you can see that they're an uneven lengths, and so they tend to be half an inch long and in varied lengths and kind of unevenly distributed about the branch. And so that's one of the identifying characteristics. Close up. If you turn this over, and I can't quite reach it because it's off the boardwalk, but the underside is very white on these needles. And one other thing is when you look at the branches, it looks kind of lacy or feathery, and you don't get that with one of the other common needle type evergreens, the Douglas fir, and so that's also an identifying trait. And this one's too big, I can't see the top, but another identifying trait for these is that the very top leader tends to be droopy and flop over. And I can just show you right here a very nice fine maple. The other one we looked at was very small. And then we've got a nice conveniently located western red cedar here, so we can take a closer look. Now, the cedar is an evergreen in which the needles are flat against the branch and overlap, and so you get a flat green evergreen. The other characteristic of a western red cedar is the bark. It has this stringy red bark. You can see there. And this was used by the Native Americans in this region to weave ropes, cloth, baskets. Incredibly, one of the most used plants in the Northwest was the western red cedar. The red alder, which we looked at earlier, was one of the other widely used trees. Okay, so let's continue on down the boardwalk and see what else we can find. So this area we're in is a little bit drier, and we can tell that because the plant community has changed. What we have here is salal. And salal is, while it can tolerate some wetness, it doesn't grow well in truly saturated soils. And so you can see we have an extensive area of salal here. And that's the nice thing about this particular wetland is you get these little microclimates where you get changes in the plant community, changes in the hydrology and the soil conditions. So you get a variety of plants to look at and ecosystems. Now this trunk right here that we're looking at, this is the bark of a western hemlock, the Tsuga heterophylla, and you can see that it is slightly grooved. One of the differences you'll note between hemlock and a Doug fir is that the bark of the Douglas fir is deeply grooved. Okay, so we'll continue on down the boardwalk. Okay, so what we have found is a Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis, and Sitka spruce really like wet areas, so you'll find them in wetlands. And if we look at these, it's an evergreen, it's got needles, so how are you going to tell it apart from others like the western hemlock or the Douglas fir? Well, this one has very distinctive bark, and I'll show you another example over here. And you can zoom in, you can look at this bark and see it's very chunked and looks like it's flaking off, and that's characteristic of the Sitka spruce. If you're close enough to touch the needles are very sharp and spiny. Needle is an appropriate term for them. But ironically, their cones are very soft and have rounded tips to the scales. And so if you can find a cone or touch the needles. That's another identifying trait. Also, if you find them in a very dry area, it's probably not a Sitka spruce. So as we walk into this area, we have a western hemlock on the right side, and we also have an area with some very large skunk cabbage and lady ferns, all of which are showing that it's fall and starting to die off. And then right next to them is this little shrub here with the green twigs and leaves, and that is a western red huckleberry. Salmonberry, and then a relatively dry area with some down trees, and then this Pacific red elderberry with the compound leaves next to it. So we move down and we can see off to our left we've got more lady fern, salmonberry, and skunk cabbage. A little bit of salal here, showing that we're in a drier spot. And then this is another hemlock. And take advantage of the time of the year in that this is fall, and so we see some of the leaves on the ground, and so this is a nice close-up of that alder leaf with deeply serrated edges, deeply veined, green on top, and then they're generally gray underneath. And here's a tree that we haven't seen. It's a tall shrub or a small tree. Generally it's called a cascara, and you can see the leaves might remind you of the alder because they're green, oval, deeply veined, but they're shiny and they're not serrated on the edges. And so that is a distinctive mark of the cascara. And this is a relatively small one, maybe about 8 feet tall. And then coming around here, we have an absolutely outstanding root ball. So this is a tree that blew over, and it's now providing habitat for a lot of different plants. So we've got a number of small hemlocks coming out. Hemlocks like growing in rich organic material, so you'll find them on nurse logs and downed logs. And you may have been saying, well, where's the water if this is a wetland? So right there in the middle of the shot is a pool of water. It's a plane going overhead. We are in an urban area. So we have a little bit of open water in the Hylebos Wetlands, but not a great deal. You don't have to have a great deal of standing water, open water at the surface to make it a wetland. And then here's some bark for you to look at. Tell me, what tree do you think that is just from the bark? Chunky, looks kind of like it's flaking off. Sitka spruce. And then right behind it, that is Tsuga heterophylla, the western hemlock. Okay, so we'll continue on. Okay, so we're on a little bridge overlooking a lot of water. So this is what, if you say wetland, most people think, well, this is what a wetland should be. We have actually flowing water through here. This is the West Hylebos Wetlands, and this is part of the West Hylebos Creek. And you can see the skunk cabbage. Nice sized skunk cabbage. And then we've got some very tall lady fern. Right next to the path, look at the bark. Yep, that's our friend Sitka spruce. And so this is a very pretty area. Down here, some of this is water parsley. And we're late in the season, so the water parsley has mostly died back. It does get quite a bit taller than this. And there's some western red cedar. And if we come around here, we can see the trunk. There's that stringy red bark. Very indicative. And salmonberry, Indian plum, lots of things that we've been seeing all throughout this wetland. Okay, so we'll continue on. Okay, so we've just come a few steps down the path, but here are, it's a fern that we haven't seen yet that I wanted to show you. It looks somewhat similar to the lady fern, so if you look in the center of this shot, you can see the frond coming up. There are several fronds coming up from the same base, which is what lady ferns do. It's tripinnate like a lady fern, but unlike the lady fern, these fronds the little leaflets get wider as you go from the tip to the base, and so you have a triangular shape to the frond. Lady ferns, and it's a bit difficult to see because they're usually so big, but they start narrow at the tip, get wider in the middle, and then get narrower as you get down to the base, and so they have more of a diamond shape. So this is a spiny wood fern. It also likes wet areas. And you can see from all of the vine maples that they also like wet areas. And we have another very nice root ball here from a tree that blew over. And as we move down here, so here's a lady fern. It's narrow at the tip, and as you move down it gets broader, and then as you get down to the base it gets narrower for a diamond shape. This is a very nice little cave almost, showing some moist areas, lady fern, and we've got some licorice fern up here and a sword fern. Okay, so we'll continue on down. Here's another spiny wood fern, and so you can see the triangular shape of the fronds. There's quite a few of them in this little area. Must be a good spot for spiny wood fern habitat. And then as we move a little bit further down, here we get to lady fern. Again, much bigger plant. Lady ferns can get much bigger than spiny wood ferns. Spiny wood ferns tend to stay fairly small. And there's a nice little red huckleberry. Has small oval leaves and green twigs, and this one's growing out of this fallen log, which is fairly common for huckleberries. Similar to the hemlock, they like rich organic soil, and they will frequently sprout out of fallen logs. And here's one we've seen before. See if by looking at the tree here you can identify it. We'll do a close-up here if I can get the knobs right on the leaves. So that's a cascara. We come in here, you can see this is the oval leaf, very shiny, deeply veined, not heavily serrated. That's the cascara. And this right here is an invasive species, the Himalayan blackberry. Unfortunately, it tends to show up in a lot of places. Very opportunistic plant that can do well many places. Okay, now here's another bit of the creek. So we can see this area has standing water. It has moving water, actually, flowing water. And there's quite a bit of water that flows through this creek, drains a fairly substantial area, and eventually down to Commencement Bay in Tacoma. And so not all wetlands have this vigorous movement of water, but Hylebos does. Okay, let's move along. So I just wanted to stop. This is a cedar that's in a very sunny spot, and I thought it would be nice to get a much better shot of the needles and leaves on a cedar. And so you can see it's these overlapping scales. The needles have over time evolved into these overlapping scales. Okay. You can see there's some orangey fronds here, or orangey branches. Like all living plants, they are going to drop some and produce new as part of their seasonal cycle. So it doesn't mean it's dying, it just means that it's that time of year. Okay, so we'll keep on down the path. Here's a nice example of licorice ferns growing out of the moss that is clinging to the side of a trunk. And so you see this a lot. And so this happens to be a red alder. And you can see as we move up, lots of licorice ferns growing up out of the moss that clings to the side of the tree. So again, licorice ferns grow out single, and they generally, you can find them in the ground, but frequently you'll find them growing out of this kind of situation on trees or on rocks that have a lot of moss on them. Okay, so here we are again along the path. And I wanted to stop and show you this. I'm not an expert on fungus, so I couldn't tell you what type of fungus these are. But there's these beautiful little caps that are growing up in this crevice of this tree, right behind the vine maple. And get a closer view. They've got little spots on them. Very pretty, but Again, I'm not an expert, so I would not touch them. Admire them. Okay. Okay. So we did see the invasive Himalayan blackberry, so I just wanted to stop and show you our native trailing blackberry. And so you can, the Himalayan blackberry had these thick canes or stalks. And the trailing blackberry, this is as thick as those vines get. It's very slender, has these 3 leaflets coming off. And as the name implies, you find it kind of lying about. It's not self-supporting. So that's our trailing blackberry. Now we've seen 4 different ferns so far. We've seen the spiny wood fern, the lady fern, the licorice fern, and the sword fern. And here's our 5th fern. This is a deer fern. Deer ferns you're only going to find in wet areas. This has a number of fronds coming up from a central clump. There's 2 of them here side by side. And it's pinnate with leaflets coming off on either side. So let me zoom in here so you can see that. And if you look at these, the top appears to be shinier than the sword fern. So far it sounded a lot like a sword fern, but there's a number of key differences. The leaflets are not serrated the way that the sword ferns are. They have very minor serration to them. And the tips are rounded. And they come down and join the stalk, the entire leaflet, instead of having just a little base that joins. And if you look at the underside of these, they do not have spores on them. These are the asexual part of the plant. And then the sexual part of the plant is specific fronds that come up. And they come up looking much different from the others. So they come up centrally, whereas the main fronds are lined somewhat flat. The reproductive fronds come straight up, and you can see the spores on the underside here. See if it'll focus that close. You have to back up a little bit there. So there are the spores on the underside. And they tend to, the leaflets tend to curl in. They tend to be somewhat narrower than the non-reproductive, and they will blacken with age. And so over here, if we look, this one, this reproductive frond here is showing that blackening with age. So that's a deer fern. You only find these in wet areas. So this is a really very pretty part of the wetland. As we move through here, you can see the western hemlock. We've had quite a bit of branches and trees coming down. When they come down across the path, the boardwalk, then they have to cut them, and that's what's happened here. Otherwise, they tend to leave this wetland pretty much alone. Now, ready for another fern, because we've got our last one here. And this is a bunch of bracken ferns, and they come up as a single stalk. And they look a bit like a lady fern or a spiny wood fern because of the tripinnate quality of the fronds, but it comes up from a single rhizome in the ground, whereas both lady ferns and wood ferns come up as a clump from a central clump. Now, if you pull these up underground, they tend to be connected, but they don't come up from a central base. And these can get quite tall as well, about 4 or 5 feet. So that's our 6th fern in a very small area. So very pretty. Aha. Okay, so we have here a cone. And this cone is from a Sitka spruce. It has rounded tips. Let's see here. Come down here. So it has somewhat rounded tips. When you squeeze it, it's very soft. And so this one shows us we have Sitka spruce around here. So if we look here, look at that bark. There's our Sitka spruce. Now, this is the trunk of a hemlock, and the bark looks deeply grooved, which would be indicative of Douglas fir. I can see going up, I can see the little cones there. Yeah, those are hemlock cones, and I can see the feathery nature of the needles. So when you're identifying something, you need multiple lines of evidence, because if I were to just come up to this tree and say, up, deeply furrowed bark, that must be a Douglas fir, I'd be incorrect. So you need multiple lines of evidence. If we look down here, there's some more of those little cones. Western hemlock has these small cones. Doug fir's much larger. And on another field trip we'll look at Doug fir cones, but we're not really going to see any here because they don't like it wet, and so there's 1 or 2 of them around here, but I'm not sure we'll get up close enough to one to see its cones. Invading the privacy of plants. That's what ecologists do. Okay. So this is a very nice spot, one of my favorite spots. Lots of different plants here. So we've got on the left side some bracken fern, and then back here, focus in, you can see the deer fern, excuse me. We've got very nice vine maple. And over time, we've had some trees come down. Now, one of these trees has just recently snapped. Every time I come here, which is several times a year, there's something new. And so this particular tree has been leaning at a precarious angle for a very long time. And the stress finally caused it to shatter. And so the decaying process will continue. It actually had a number of fungi growing on it before, but that will just continue. This is a really very pretty spot. I'm very fond of it. And if you look down here, this is a little cluster of Sitka spruce cones at the edge of this little pond. Pool of standing water. back it out a bit. Come around here. So we can see in here we've got some lady ferns, some skunk cabbage, and we look at this bark, dead giveaway, Sitka spruce. And so that one, however, has been decaying for a while. And on this side, we've got some hemlock, western hemlock. And behind it, there's that bark again, and there's another Sitka spruce. So they really like this area. So we can see some tall lady ferns, tall salmonberry, skunk cabbage, and right back here is a fern we haven't seen for a little while. That's the sword fern. And so I know it's a sword fern because we've got pinnate and the leaflets are serrated and the tips are pointed. And if you look at the base, there's a couple of fronds coming out. So we've got some very active birds around here. Chickadees, if they'll hold still. So it's the black-capped chickadee. I'll back it out again. They are very active little birds, so hard to catch them. Here's some Pacific red elderberry. That's another elderberry. It's starting to turn a bit. It is fall after all. Can't resist listening to the chickadees for a little while. Okay, so one thing that you usually see at wetlands is horsetail, equisetum, and this is a clump here. They're not looking very happy, so they're going to be dying back soon as part of fall. But fungus, I mentioned decaying of fallen wood, and this is a type of fungus, artist conch, that grows on trees as they're decaying. This is a snag. A dead tree goes up about 15 feet and then stops, no branches. And so, zoom in for a close-up on that. Part of the decay and recycling process that goes on. Okay, so we're just about back at the start again, so that's going to wind up our tour of a wetland, looking at some of the different species that live here. As I was mentioning before, with fungus, how you have this decay process, and it's fall, and so a certain number of these plants are going to be dying back and decaying into the soil, which is one of the things that makes a wetland such a rich ecosystem. And so we're going to wind up here. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And maybe see you at my next video. Bye-bye.